Yama. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the country upon which I'm presenting from, which is Wiradjuri country. There is a photo of Wiradjuri country at the top of this slide. It is the bottom star on the map. I would also like to acknowledge Gamilaroi, as I am a Gamilaroi woman and I come from this country. Gamilaroi is the top star on the map, but it is the bottom photo. I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, for without them I would not have an education and my children and their children would not have the opportunities that are available to them. Welcome to the presentation. My name is Cheree Dean. I am from Sturt University, which is located on Wiradjuri in Australia. My presentation is called Indigenous Education in Early Childhood. Just some background information about what I'll be presenting today and where it is from. Most of it is within a subject that I teach. Indigenous education is what the subject is called. It is a subject located within our birth to 5-year degree. It is multimodal delivery, so I deliver mainly online, but it does also include videos, an online workshop which is live as well for the students. And I encourage the students to do professional reflections about the subject throughout. The cohort of students that I do have are mainly from New South Wales, 70%. We do have a 2% intake from international students. With regards to Australian Indigenous students, I do not get many. I may get 1 or 2 for each session. When I ask students how they feel about Indigenous education in early childhood, these are the kinds of responses I get. As you can see, it revolves around the lack of confidence, experience, a feeling out of their depth, tokenism, and which all leads to avoiding Indigenous concepts or sharing. There is a very small proportion of students that are confident and think that they're adequate in understanding Indigenous history and culture and can do Indigenous perspectives in the early childhood setting. As I have said before, the subject is called Indigenous education. And I pose this question to the students: what is early childhood Indigenous education? And I pose it in this way because what I talk about in this subject is not the actual history or traditional cultural aspects of Indigenous education, but what I do mainly talk about is how non-Indigenous early childhood educators, or mainly non-Indigenous early childhood educators, can share Indigenous education within the early childhood setting. So when I ask students, what is the early childhood Indigenous education? I get a range of answers going from peoples, countries, the Indigenous concepts, some organisations that they might be familiar with, families, cultures, role and responsibility, history, identity. Sometimes they also come up with the pedagogies as they're becoming more popular within the Australian curriculum. So that's a wide range of ideas that they come with in that first module. To help them organise what Indigenous education could look like in an early childhood setting, I then organised their ideas into 3 areas: about Indigenous children or child, about the Indigenous content, which is shared with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and Indigenous communities. Looking further into these 3 aspects, starting with the Indigenous child or children, the students come up with the ideas of identity, background, families, how they learn, development, likes and interests. However, I like to take this a step further, and when we talk about identity, is acknowledging Indigenous peoples. When we're talking about background, what Indigenous country are they on, living and working? When we talk about families, it's not just about the people, but the relationships, the role and responsibility. And also in this aspect, I talk about pedagogy. How do Indigenous children learn? How do they respond? And this is where I sometimes introduce cultural pedagogies. Of course, the EYLF, which is our framework, why and how have Indigenous children demonstrated that they have met these outcomes? When we talk about Indigenous content, remember that I've said that this is for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. They talk about the purpose, the room, place, families, and how outcomes are achieved. Once again, I take this further. For example, with the purpose for the children, are we sharing knowledge or are we sharing value? So I question what the purpose is of the Indigenous content that they're sharing with the children. How do we communicate this? What do we hear children say? And how do we respond as educators? I also ask them to look in their room. What Indigenous content do you see, your children and family see? So I try to give a second layer of learning. With Indigenous communities, we look at these broad themes: communicate, room, families, benefits, organisations. Taking it a step further, I ask them, how do we communicate with the child and their families? How do we communicate knowledge with Indigenous communities? How do we communicate our goals, whether it's the child goals or centre goals or our own educator learning goals? What are the benefits? How do we show the value? Organisations, what are the local Indigenous organisations that we can work with as well? So as you can see, these 3 aspects of Indigenous education include a diverse ideas of what Indigenous education can look like in the early childhood centre. It helps them organise these thoughts. And when I take away those main ideas, you'll be able to see how this diagram works and how I explain it to students. Most importantly, I want you to know that these aspects not only can work alone, but they interlink with each other. And hopefully you noticed that as I was explaining each aspect. They can have individual journeys and focuses. For example, if you have no Indigenous children in the service, they can concentrate on Indigenous content becomes a focus. What are they sharing with the children? Where are they getting this information from? And if they do not have that knowledge or they want more knowledge, they can go and seek that knowledge with Indigenous communities. So you can see the focus in this one is Indigenous content and has a relationship with their communities. Looking at another way we can use this diagram, if you have Indigenous children within the service, to know more about the Indigenous child, you may need to know about the Indigenous communities. What do the Indigenous children do outside of the service? And then you can incorporate Indigenous content. So you can starting with Indigenous child as your focus, learning about their communities, and then place it into the content. Finally, starting with Indigenous communities, what are they in the area that the service is in? What content can you work with to share with them? And even though you may not have Indigenous children in the service, in engaging with Indigenous communities, you could either increase or have Indigenous children enrolling into that service. As I've said, each of these aspects can be its own focus. They can move and share different aspects with each other. So it's very important to understand that this diagram is not stagnant. It is very much alive and moves to the situation that the educator is in. I do ask the students to reflect upon their knowledge as they work through the subject with me, and especially in regards to this diagram. The common themes have been using the resources explored. They have more confidence. They are excited to undertake further training. They are giving it a go, implementing Indigenous perspectives. Their approaches have been strengthened and they feel confident to engage appropriately with the children, community, and the curriculum, what they're meant to do within the room. So I do see a big change of how students feel towards Indigenous education. And remember in the beginning, we talked about how some students do have confidence, even though it's a small proportion. After they reflect, they come back normally with this, that they didn't realise what a lack of knowledge they did have, and they're willing to continue the learning journey. Or they didn't realise that they weren't doing enough to embed Indigenous practices or supporting Indigenous learners. So they're still learning and utilising this diagram as a learning journey. Measuring the impact. As I said, I do ask the students to professionally reflect, and it is part of their assessment item. I mainly ask them to reflect about their journey in the subject, as well as how they can or how it will influence their future practice. 77% of students reflected on one or more of an aspect of this understanding. So 26 for reflected on Indigenous children, 26%, sorry. 24% reflected on Indigenous content, which included perspectives, and 26% reflected on Indigenous communities, in particular community partnerships. Now, of this 77%, 24% reflected on all three aspects of that diagram. So they talked about how it relates and how those aspects work together to create for their future practice, a more appropriate practice. The value and future research. The value for Indigenous children is very evident. But for future research, what is the impact for the Indigenous child when this knowledge is implemented? Indigenous content. How does the early childhood sector allow graduates to use this knowledge would be a great idea for future research. But the practice value is that students are engaging with Indigenous content, or student teachers, I should say, are engaging with Indigenous content for their learners. and the Indigenous communities. How can Indigenous communities be involved in developing Indigenous education in early childhood? So that's about engaging communities to have a deeper relationship with the service rather than just with the content. Before I leave, I'd like to recommend that you look at Dr. Chantel Gibson's work, Valuing Indigenous People's Health and Wellbeing in Early Childcare Services. She has some great information and I highly recommend her. She is a keynote speaker and she's also my sister. So please have a look at her work. Thank you for viewing my presentation, and I hope that we can continue Indigenous education for all learners within Australia. Thank you.